Hello, and welcome to another episode of Up Close and Personal, the FESPA podcast with myself, Richard Askham, and my guest today, Chloe Combi. Good morning, Chloe.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
It's very, very wet. It's very windy. It's a new year, as we've discussed. But I'm really well. I'm excited about 2023.
That's good. And we always do this, by the way, that this may go out in March. So let's imagine it's warm, the spring started, the flowers are coming up in the garden. So, let's adopt.
Let's hope so. Let's project ourselves into that. That sounds good.
Absolutely. So that's good. And Chloe and I met a few months ago, actually, at an event in Berlin. And Chloe, your sort of background, your business, your topic, if you like, is really built around the Gen Z mindset. And I wanted to bring you onto the podcast today to apply that expertise into our crazy world of personalization. We've spoken a little bit before about the new show, the FESPA launching in May in Munich, the Personalisation Experience, which is really to bring together as many opinions as we can of what we think it is and what we think it could be. But what does personalisation mean to you?
Personalization. I mean, I do work with Gen Z and Gen A, and I think personalization is something I've thought about an awful lot. And I think fundamentally, personalization means your story. And I think that's true of how I view personalization and how other people do, because I think in this kind of world, which I think we just discussed before we went on, of sort of personal branding, we started out, as you very cleverly did, this notion that it was like your name put on something, so it kind of symbolized you. But where we are now, and I think why personalization has become so powerful, is that we are in an age where everybody has a brand, and it doesn't matter whether that brand is big or small. You might have 10 followers or you might have 10 million followers, but to a lesser or greater extent, unless you decide to be completely off grid, you have a kind of a brand, and most people are trying to push that brand. And I talk about this all the time, and I think the power of the brand is not necessarily even what you look like or what you wear or what you believe. It's your personal story, and I think that's where the power of a brand always lies, and where it becomes really interesting, and what promotes one person over another. And really, I mean, that is when we think about social media. I think social media is a really interesting thing to think about, because it's changing so very fast, and it's an interesting story to sort of begin with, I guess, because it's really taken off in the last 10 years. And as I sort of said just before we came on, I think the cradle of social media absolutely was reality TV, because it wasn't about the person's talent. It was also always very much about their personal story. And that's kind of where I think reality TV imploded, because then that kind of metastasized in something ridiculous, because then everybody had this sob story about a dying grandmother or, a lost sibling. And it just didn't feel very authentic. And I think, if you like, social media kind of rose out the ashes of that, because social media was very much, it was really interesting to begin with. And again, I think it's metastasizing something that feels a bit inauthentic, because unlike traditional, say, celebrities, where you had these gatekeepers that were like TV bookers or record company executives or film directors who chose who was going to be famous and who was going to have a voice and who was going to have a brand. Anybody could become famous on social media, and that was only if you had an interesting enough story. It wasn't really what you said, it was a story you had to say. And that, I think, for me, is kind of long-winded way of saying what I think personalization is. It is your story, and really it supersedes, I think, personal brand. But I think that whole personalization thing is wrapped up in your personal story, which is your personal brand. And that's as true for me as it is for you, as it is for the millions of 16-year-olds trying to make it big still on TikTok, even though I think TikTok's diminishing.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to that. That's really interesting, actually, and something that we haven't considered so far in this series is that the world of branding, of course, goes beyond the classic and well-known consumer brands that we've all known and grown up with, and they are the ones largely that have been using personalization in an attempt to re-engage with almost I call it a lost generation. I don't mean that in a bad way, but that they don't know where they are. One of the biggest changes, certainly in my life, is the internet, and with the internet came an elaborate game of hide and seek for consumers, prior to which brands knew exactly where you were, exactly what you bought, exactly when you bought it, and therefore they didn't really have to market to you. They just had to market to their retailers, and they did the rest. Along comes the internet and allows us all to go anywhere. And they don't know where we are. We've scattered. So for me, personalization was used by brands, and I go back to the sort of benchmark Share a Coke campaign in 2013-14. In an attempt to re-engage with their customers, they used their name. They said hello, rather than dear sir or madam. It was hello, Chloe. And I think in the branded world of consumer brands, that's been quite effective, at the very least, of making you sit up and pay attention. But you're extending that into personal brand, which I think is really interesting, because we can all broadcast. We're doing that right now. We can create our own media. We're doing that right now. So how do you feel that element can benefit the world that personalization was almost, it's not created for, because it's been around for millennia, but really in our world now, where do you think personalization can best be deployed?
Really interesting question. And I think that is even more so with young people. That scattering thing that you describe is absolutely true, because 15, 20 years ago, if you wanted to find a young person who was really into celebrity, you advertised in Heat magazine. If you wanted to find a kid who was really into indie music, you would advertise in the NME. If you wanted to find almost every young person under the age of, let's say, 16, you advertised on Saturday night television.
Yeah.
And that was true certainly of older people. People knew whether to advertise in, Auto Trader or Marie Claire, and people were very distilled, I think, into these silos and were very easily accessible. Now, absolutely, as you say, the internet has kind of completely scattered and dispersed us, and I think that's even truer of younger people, because if you go into for example, a classroom of 15-year-olds, it would not be unusual for every single one of those 15-year-olds in that, say, of 30 or 35, to have never bought a magazine, and all of their media to be consumed online. So I think from the kind of branding and personalization point of view, there is a real kind of lever of power. But I think in some ways that the relationship has flipped, that the assumption was always that you were selling the brand and the item to the young person to kind of consume, and they were your kind of consumer. But in a way, I think what's changed is big brands now want people to be their marketers and advertisers, because what you want in an ideal world, and what everybody's doing, is assuming brands that they believe reflect them. So that, if you're heavily into sort of sustainability or ethics or social justice or glamorous beauty or any of those things that your brand represents, that you are saying, this is a brand that represents me, and that brand sort of becomes part of your identity. And in an ideal world, and that is, I guess, the sort of the ideal, is that you will promote that brand as part of your identity. And I mean, fundamentally, that's what the sort of influencer relationship started out as an influencer who has lots of clout saying, I absolutely love this makeup brand over that makeup brand, or I absolutely love, this car or this drink over this drink or car. But that has actually, I think, almost had its day. And actually, I think the influencer marketing power is massively declining, because again, it's that authenticity word, and it's the same thing of people going, oh God, not again with the sob story, or not again with this, because it becomes overused. And I think at some point around about sort of 2000 and 2018, 19, people got quite weary with that. And then I think the pandemic hit, and it really shifted how people were thinking about kind of branding and their own personal brand. And I think that kind of influencer clout changed, and that is demonstrable. There has been some really, quite clear evidential cases that very, very influential influencers with enormous followings, and I don't really want to name anyone because it feels a bit cruel, have been aligned with brands, and them saying, oh, you must buy this or buy that actually has completely failed to do that. And it's actually, the material sales have been very few. So what you're seeing now, and this is another huge challenge for brands who I sometimes think get really stuck on a model. I think that's successful. And what you're still seeing is this obsession with the sort of influencer marketing relationship. What you're actually seeing now are these very influential people who are actually thinking, I don't want to advertise a brand. I don't want to be Sprite or Coca-Cola or Porsche or whatever the brand might be. I want my own brand. And that's what you're starting to see now. And we talked about it before. And I think this is a really interesting question, because a really good example of that, a really powerful example that has been happening over the last 2 weeks and still is as we speak, and who knows what will happen when this comes out, but I still think it's relevant, is this Logan Paul and KSI prime drink brand that they have, and I'm saying this in inverted commas, quite sarcastic inverted commas, created. And it's kind of being promoted as a health drink, but I think that's I think a misrepresentation if you read the ingredients. I don't think it's probably as bad as something like Monster in terms of health, but it's
the good sugar, is it?
But it's not great. And they have created, again, those slightly sarcastic air commas, this prime drink. It's gone absolutely nuclear. And for the people who don't know, who Logan Paul is, kind of one of this kind of prankish, he started out as a kind of a prankish YouTuber, and has kind of grown into this enormous brand along with his brother, and he lives this kind of slightly playboyish, I always think it's a bit like, do you remember that show in the 2010s, Entourage? I think he lives like the online version of that world. And sort of KSI, who I think is an awful lot more likable, and I think it's, in a way, it's a shame he's aligned himself with Logan Paul, and both of them are kind of trying to, you know, recreate themselves slightly as kind of boxers and sort of, you know, and they do these boxing matches that are really, again, marketing opportunities. But anyway,
so just to pick up on that, sorry to interrupt, is there then, given the notion that we're talking about is personalization, is there then, with what you're describing with Logan Paul and others, social media influencers, a shift towards almost inverse personalization where everybody wants to be them?
Yes, and that's just what I was getting to. So it's a long sort of it's worth telling the story. But anyway, they've created this drink called Prime, and there was just after New Year in the freezing cold, there were literally queues at 4 a.m. mostly of boys and their parents queuing up for this drink. And there was, you know, these really interesting online stories about people massively spiking the prices and people paying hundreds, if not thousands, for the collection of drinks. And where I find this interesting is, because I've been asked about this a lot, is what is this fascination with buying this drink? And in some cases, spending hundreds or thousands of pounds and queuing for hours on a January morning. And I believe, and this is where the personalization thing is interesting, and as you say, this kind of consuming of other people's personalization, is that boys think, a bit like some weird YouTube Disney mashup, is if they drink Prime, they are drinking the kind of KSI, Logan Paul potion, if you like, and they will wake up tomorrow with somewhat of their life. And I think by consuming, it's not the drink, it's the brand, that somehow by some weird Disney-esque osmosis, they are going to wake up and consume a bit of Logan Paul or KSI and wake up like him. And that is really interesting. And I think that's where we're going next. It's because, and the personalization thing, and this is where Gen A become really interesting, is because we've had this sort of self-branding and this very narcissistic self-branding for about 10 years now. What you're moving more towards now is a collective story. And what you're starting to see emerge on the internet is not so much about the personal branding, but it's kind of content branding. So I believe we're going to move towards, and this is, I think the Logan Paul thing is a really interesting idea, is almost like a tribal experience. So you still do have that personalization experience, but there's also, and you see this particularly, I think, with boys and young men on the internet, on their really big social media sites. And again, I don't want to get too much into it because we've talked about him so much, but this kind of Andrew Tate guy, which is a really big story at the moment. It's this tribal experience. So you get to be not your own personal powerhouse, but you are still a powerhouse, but by joining our powerhouse and our story, you get to join into this power collective. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. You're listening to the Up Close and Personal podcast with me, Richard Askham, and my guest today, Chloe Combi, and we're into a really interesting discussion today. And here's one for you, Chloe. One of the interesting things about the Share a Coke campaign was the reason that they actually did it was because they'd seen evidence and statistics that showed that 50% of the current crop of teenagers, and we go back to 2013, so they're all 10 years older now, by the way, didn't drink soft drinks anymore, didn't drink sugary drinks. And they, it terrified them because they could see their business model after 127 years of success disappearing out of view. So they invented the Share a Coke campaign in order to engage with teenagers by saying hello and using their name. What you're describing is almost the opposite of that, because instead of the brand needing to find the tribe is now trying to create a brand.
Yes, exactly that.
And that's a 10-year evolution, relatively quick in historical terms, but actually quite long in the world that we live in right now. It's taken 10 years to go from, huge consumer brands wanting to put your name on something to individuals wanting everybody to associate themselves with the one thing.
Absolutely, and almost, well, very much so, put their name on it.
Yeah.
And I mean, in a way, I mean, and I definitely come from the Share a Coke thing, and that sort of individualism is better, and that whole kind of, you're all an individual. But what you're seeing, and this isn't surprising at all, if you think about the economic and social structures and the difficulties that young people haven't created but they've inherited, there's this enormous sense of resentment. It's like, this isn't fair. I can never afford to buy a house. I have inherited all these, like, the economy has crashed, the housing market has crashed, it's really hard to get a job, all of those things. And those are not problems that a 16 or 17-year-old has created. That's very much a problem that someone maybe 2 or 3 generations older than them has created. So I mean, I always say that history doesn't repeat itself. It can't, but it rhymes. And what you're seeing is almost, I think, going back to this kind of tribal collective, this safety in numbers. And I'm not saying that in a romantic way, because lots of it's quite toxic. And I don't think it's necessarily with good intentions, particularly revolving around these kind of social media tribes. And I think, that they are marketing opportunities, but it's not really surprising. It's that whole sense that it's safety in numbers, but not the safety in numbers. But if you join our tribe, if you subscribe to this particular channel, if you buy our drink, you become part of this tribe, and you come, and with that tribe becomes safety and privileges. Now, is that an authentic and is it an accurate message? No. If you drink Prime, you are not going to wake up in Logan Paul's mansion tomorrow surrounded by what he suggests is lots of kind of girls and cars and swimming pools and so forth. But I do think, and this is the power of marketing, that there is that sort of sense that you might, and you could,
It's
and
aspirational marketing, then, basically.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is why it's so interesting, and I think that's going to be the future. It's going to be back to so the personalization is not going to be so much about the individual. It's going to be more about the kind of collective.
Absolutely.
But I also do think, and I don't want to get I don't make too many assumptions, but that seems to be a particularly powerful message for young men and boys at the moment. And we could talk about those reasons, but I think we might slightly veer off.
Do that in depth, Chloe, and for anybody listening and hoping to come to the show in May in Munich, we're also hoping Chloe's going to be there to speak live, because I think there's so much here that we can't fit into 20 minutes.
No, exactly, and I want to keep it quite tight, so I'm not going to talk about the reasons that might be a very appealing thing to young men. But when you talk to girls and young women and people who identify as female, I think there's still very much more of a power in the story. And that is really interesting, because if you look at the things that are really interesting young women, and I think the brands that are really, really cooking with young women, those are brands that have a really interesting story. And we talked about in the beginning about how the alcohol industry is really fueled by these very romantic and sort of interesting stories. And I think when you talk, I think that's something that's being really picked up by the cosmetic industry. I think it's something that's being really picked up by the beauty and the fashion industry. And what's very interesting and very different is 10 years ago, around the sort of time of the sort of Coke industry, what was also absolutely having an astronomical moment and in some ways reshaped culture in every way was the kind of very narcissistic, capitalist, decadent Kardashians, who became for a decade, the most influential, certainly brand and story that probably it will be the most dominant, I think, of the early 21st century. And what you're seeing in that space is a relinquishing of that very sort of decadent, narcissistic, I'm rich, I have everything story. And it's much more about this kind of ethical, interesting, deciding to do better, make the world better. And that is the story in those spaces, which is very different to that kind of tribal bros together story. That seems to be the thing that's really fueling things like the beauty and the fashion industry at the moment. It's kind of ethical, interesting backstories with very, very interesting people who challenge the norm, and I think that's kind of interesting. So it's my point being is it's not one thing. It's not kind of, there's not myopic thing. There's lots of different things that are working, but interestingly, they all revolve around that personalization, that story, in very different ways.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I guess what's happening now in when I say this day and age, I sound like an old fart, so apologies for that. But in this day and age, everything seems to happen at a more heightened volume, but burn out quicker. So I go back, what we're talking about with the Prime campaign, for example, you could relate back all the way back to when everybody wanted to wear Dr. Martin boots because that's what made them look cool. So that, our allyship with products, and therefore the tribe that product allows you to feel a member of, is very well rooted in history. And right now, I guess what everybody has is a megaphone that they never had before of social media, and the ability to broadcast their own content. That's the change point, really. And this is why I mentioned the internet being the biggest change in our history. What do you see? And this is my last question for today, because I can't keep you all day, although I would love to. What would you see from a Gen Z perspective? Because let's be honest, people tuning into this from a print, brand, agency, marketing world, they want to know what these guys are going to be buying. So that they can adapt and their approach to that desire right now, and put Logan Paul to one side and what have you. Where do you see this current generation Z going with their consumer desires and habits over the next 3, 5, 10 years?
I'll give you 3 things that I think are really key and that I think are really interesting. Ethics is really important. Don't get too carried away, because with what's happened with the whole social justice or climate justice, or we're an ethical brand, is brands have oversold the ethics and forgot to sell the brand. And I spoke to a number of kids the other day about fashion, and they said, we're absolutely sick to death of everything being a teachable moment. And a kid said, I just want to buy some sneaks. I don't want to be taught something. And I thought that was a really interesting line, and I embedded it into the book because I think that has reached its tipping point. 2, it has to be affordable, because we are entering a point where the middle class has pretty much vanished. You've got kind of very wealthy falling off to begin, financially stretched, to really struggling with money. And I think that's certainly true. That's true in lots of Western countries. So brands have to think about a way to make it accessible to young people, because this is the first generation that are going to be worse off than their parents and grandparents. And quite simply, if your brand is aspirational but no one young can afford it, it's never going to be kind of embedded as this sort of Gen Z brand. Yeezys did a slightly different story, but we won't talk about Yeezys. But I think that kind of aspirational thing, I think, is important, but it has to be something that's achievable as well. But the third one, and I think this is something that's really been lost in the last 10 years, because we've all been trying to have these kind of teachable, ethical moments, which are still powerful, it's pleasurable. Because if this world is difficult, and I think the coming 5 years are going to be extremely challenging in lots of different ways. And I think in times of kind of social and economic strife, which we're certainly entering into, people want distraction and they want pleasure. And I think whether it's something you watch or something you eat or something you put on your body or your face or a form of entertainment, you want to feel like it makes the world a little bit better. And I think that those three things, is it good for the world? I think that's not going to go away, but I think people need to rejig that message a little bit. I think, is it something that I can actually bring into my life? I mean, there's a reason, kids really like, Gucci and De Beers diamonds, probably if they looked at them, but these aren't big Gen Z brands because quite simply they're not achievable. But I think the third most important one is something very simple, but something that's been really lost. Is it pleasurable? Is it fun? Does it make my life better? Or simpler or more enjoyable? Does it switch off things for an hour? And I think that third one is the most important one. And again, really interesting from a personalization and story point of view, because it's interesting then to tell a story about, what do you do when you see something amazing, or you read something amazing, or you wear something amazing? You tell people about it, and you bring it in the eye. I watched the most amazing show. I found the most amazing dress. I've discovered the most amazing makeup brand, and it's made my skin amazing, and it becomes part of your story. And I think that's really, really powerful.
And it is quite interesting, isn't it? And Christmas, I guess, the holidays that we've just been through is a great example where we've all got a little bit more time on our hands. It is amazing how you take ownership of bringing information to somebody that they're hearing for the first time. Have you seen such and such on Amazon Prime? No. Oh, you've got to watch it. It's the best.
I've discovered this. Yeah.
And I become your personal broadcast hero sort of thing, as a result of bringing you a bit of information that was perfectly accessible, but you just hadn't found it.
Absolutely. And I think if you can really trigger that excitement, and it feels like a discovery, but it also feels like a sharing moment. And again, that's like, the Coke thing, because it wasn't so much discovering your name. It was more exciting actually to discover your mum's name or your friend with an unusual name, and it becomes like a sharing moment. And I think anything, and this can work for brands all across industries, if it's something that people are excited to share, that in and of itself becomes a kind of cultural viral moment, and you hope an absolute online viral moment.
It comes very much back to the individual as well. And one thing I've spoken about for years now, Chloe, is the notion that why is it as human beings, when we buy each other gifts, we also want to watch them being unwrapped? Even though we know what it is, we actually want to see your reaction to that gift. So we're back to that share point, and we can bring all of this back, this beautiful conversation that we've had today, all of this back to really it's that directness of emotive transfer, if you like, between two people with something that means something, and on there's half a chance if it means something that they'll keep it. And therein lies the value for the brand, because as I said to you before, I didn't buy that bottle of personalized Coca-Cola because I was thirsty. I bought it because and paid more for it than I would normally do, because I wanted to have my name and my family's name attached with an iconic product, and we share that memory forever.
And absolutely. And I think in some ways, that those are our occasions now, aren't they? I mean, if you think about, so for example, thinking specifically about Generation Z, and really big TV series and why Stranger Things distinguishes itself over and above something that was as good but didn't go viral. And this again goes back to both great storytelling and the sort of projection of the self, and I think and they did a really smart thing where they created on Spotify the personalized playlists whenever everyone sort of shared. And I think that's really smart, creating kind of content around a brand, and we'll talk about that hopefully in Munich. But again, and this goes back to what we were saying 5 minutes ago, it's that communal experience, and I think in some ways the internet has both united and isolated us. And I think that the isolation is actually kind of a negative thing, but the really positive thing is there is no such thing as a water cooler moment, but those become our water cooler moments. And it's not just TV, it very much is brands. It's like, you've got to look at this, and that is our modern shared experience. It's our modern stories, it's our modern storytelling, it's how we tell stories as well. So yeah, I think that kind of that pleasure thing has become a little bit neglected, but it cannot be underestimated.
Great. Chloe, you've been a wonderful guest this morning. Thank you for taking the time to join me on the Up Close and Personal podcast. Thank you for listening. Hopefully, if you're coming to the show in May in Munich, you'll hear a lot more from Chloe. She's got a lot more to talk about, and I really can't wait to hear it either. But for now, thank you, Chloe, and thank you also, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.